Wonderful. And so welcome everybody to this first part of the Adolescence series. Today we're going to be looking at demystifying the journey of adolescence. My name is Korah. I am the coordinator of the Center of Excellence for Behavior Management. I do have a second presentation in the new year, and I can't recall off the top of my head which month I'm going to be presenting it, but please go and look on the CEBM website. All of our events are there, and I will be doing a second one on adolescence and anxiety. And so that will be a follow-up to this one. So I strongly invite you to go and take a look. And so my idea behind this presentation today was to kind of set the stage a little bit about what's typical to expect for an adolescent, and not to get bogged down by some of the behavior that we may see, that we may think is problematic. And truly, it may be challenging, but it doesn't mean that it's a problem in itself. It's just part of development at the adolescence phase. And so I kind of wanted to tease that apart a little bit to help make sense of what's typical of the journey, and what are the times where we need to, not to worry necessarily, but to see it that it's a grander problem than just typical development, and how can we support and help. And so before I begin, I just wanted to define the word adolescence. And so adolescence basically means growing into maturity. And so understanding that an adolescent, a teen, is not mature just yet. They're not even a young adult just yet. And of course, as society has moved on over the generations, the phase of adolescence has actually widened more and more. And so it used to be, a question of, let's say, five to, a bit more than that of years. And now some individuals stay in adolescence much, much longer. I feel that in general, our society is much more peer oriented. And because teens stay in school longer and so forth, it kind of makes it that they're not as autonomous as the previous generations before then. And so I kind of wanted to walk through 4 different insights before I cover the presentation outline. The first one is that the transition of adolescence ideally would be kind of like a bridge, where we would like for the teen to go from childhood to adulthood in a very straightforward type of manner. And unfortunately, it really isn't the case. The transition from childhood to adulthood is actually more like a maze, where depending on the student, they get into dead ends, and they get stuck sometimes, and there's back and forth that happens. And you may see a bit of maturity happen, and then it seems like as if they're going backwards and forwards. And so it's actually quite typical, and not to be worried about in terms of adolescence. It really comes in waves. It's similar to the preschooler. I get these questions all the time, and I feel that preschoolers and teens are very similar in this way, that the transition is something that's more fluid, and that depends on the individual, and has waves to it. And so it can come and go in terms of moments of maturity and moments of impulsiveness where there's not much self-regulation. The second insight is that adolescence is not really its own phase, although now that it's getting longer and longer, we may see it as its own phase. But really, adolescence is kind of a combination of childhood and adulthood, where you have some moments where the teen may feel like they're more childlike, more babyish, more immature, more impulsive, and so forth, and moments where they're showing more maturity, showing responsibility, showing that they want to, take on all of the fruits and responsibilities of adulthood. But, as I mentioned before, it really is a fluidity back and forth. And so it's not its own phase in the sense that it's really a combination of the two. The third insight is that although peer relationships are quite typical and normal in the sense that it's common, this is what we see all the time, we need to be mindful that it is actually not a natural thing. In the more recent generations, even adults, I feel, are very peer-oriented towards their friends. And it wasn't the case up until, the last, I don't know how many generations, but let's say in the last 5, 6 generations, we are noticing that there's a huge shift in our society in terms of peer relationships. Whereas before, family took a more central role and hierarchy was very important, we also had bigger nuclear families where children had more siblings and they spent time with their siblings, their older siblings or younger siblings. Whereas now we've got smaller and smaller nuclear families with 2 kids, one child family. And so oftentimes their exposure to kids their age are peers and not necessarily family members. And so there's really this shift in our society, and social media has really brought that to a whole other level in terms of exposure to peers. And so we must be careful that peers, not that there shouldn't be relationship with peers, but it should not take over the relationship with adults. How important that is that adults remain involved in teens' lives, even if you have a teen that is, older and more mature. It doesn't mean that the adults should phase out and that their friends should take more space. I think it's important that we keep having space in their lives as mentors and such from the adult perspective. And the fourth insight before we move on to the outline of the presentation is that emotional, behavioral, and learning problems need to be seen as an extra layer to the challenges of adolescent journey in the first place. And so adolescence itself has its own challenge, but then if you've got a student that has emotional difficulties, behavioral difficulties, or learning difficulties, those are an add-on to everything else that they would be typically living as an adolescent. And so the path remains the same, but it just makes it that much more challenging for some students. And so why is it that some students tend to be able to walk through this journey of adolescence more easily, and others just get so caught up in many different ways, whether it's to distract themselves or get caught up in peer pressure and so forth. And so it all depends on the teen. It depends on their sensitivity. It depends on, if they have a good rapport with the adults and so forth. And so all of that is just an added layer to the additional challenges in itself. So today we're going to be looking at 6 different sections in this presentation. The first one we're going to look at in terms of the awareness, the cognitive explosion that happens at adolescence. We're going to have a moment on this. That's part 1. Part 2, we're going to look at in terms of becoming an adult. We call this individuation. And so becoming your own person and all of the fruit that comes with that, which is being independent, which is being responsible, being able to understand consequences, to be able to temper yourself and so forth. And so this is the process of coming into your own, understanding your interests, your thoughts, your will, not being fusional to others and so forth. And so we'll look at the individuation process. Third portion, we're going to look at the emotional journey that teens get caught up in, given the path of their development. And so we're going to look at that as point 3. Oh, I said 6, I meant 5, excuse me. Point 4, 4, we're going to look at, so when teens take a wrong turn, and what do we mean by wrong turn? What does that look like, and what should we look out for, and so forth. And then the last part we're going to look at is, so what do teens need from us adults? From their parents, their family, but also from their school, from their teacher, from their from support staff, from the professional that's there and so forth, their mentors, their coach. What do they need from adults to help them walk through this journey in a way that it will minimize them getting distracted by these challenges and taking sidelines? So let's start by the first point, which is the explosion of awareness. And so, of course, at adolescence, there's a huge developmental process that's happening there with the brain. Teens are not finished with developing their brain. Yes, as from birth till at least mid-20s, there is an ongoing development of the brain from the stem, slowly trickling through the prefrontal cortex. Now, what's important about the prefrontal cortex is that this is what bears all the fruit of executive functioning, being able to have perspective, to be able to reflect on things, to be able to temper your emotions, to have self-regulation, and so forth. And these are just some examples, but this is the fruit of prefrontal cortex. Now, the imagery you have here on your right is part of a research Now with neuroscience, we have a better capacity to understand where the brain gets activated and which parts are working when. And we realized as we did these research that a child's not born with all their capacity of brain functioning. They're born with a very primitive part of the brain, and as they grow up, but with right conditions. And so you could have a student for whom very sensitive, easily overwhelmed by emotions, has a really hard time managing situations, and that hypersensitive child, whether because they're gifted or that they're on the autism spectrum or that they're hypersensitive continuum and so forth, all of that can impact the capacity to mature. And so those students, it can take them longer to mature. Similarly to that are students that live adversity, childhood adversity, traumas, whether it's violence, neglect, and so forth. All of that also can have an impact on the brain development, because if the child and teen is preoccupied with survival, it's a luxury to grow your prefrontal cortex. And so the pace at which the cortex will grow is much, much slower than a neurotypical child for whom conditions are going well and not living these very high adverse types of situations. And so it helps us to understand when you're working with a group of students and you're noticing, even in the same family, you could have twins even that have a similar background in family, but even though they have a similar background, depending on how that impacts them and how they take it in and internalize it, you could have twins that can come out quite differently because of their own uniqueness to each. And so it's not just a question of environment, it's also a question of who the individual is themselves. And so understand that, if we look here at the pictures, the third picture here is the teen brain. And you can see that it's not quite there yet compared to a 20-year-old. And so even your neurotypical child who has, a good, stable life, not too stressful and so forth, still has not built all of their capacity in order to show maturation. And so to keep that in mind, I have here on the left-hand side a YouTube link that talks about explaining the development of the teen brain. I invite you to go and Google into YouTube, not to Google, excuse me, to put into the search in YouTube, the teenage brain explained in the SciShow by Hank Green. It's a wonderful video. It's only 10 minutes. I invite you to go and take a look at that to just, get some more information in terms of brain development. And so the way as the brain develops itself, it really has two impacts in terms of awareness, cognitive awareness, and reflection. And so there's two ways that it plays out. It plays out in the reflection, and it also plays out in terms of what we call the speculative consciousness. And so basically these two walk into these three sections. And so the consciousness is the first two, and the speculative is the third one. So let's look at that in an example, just so I can illustrate a little better what I mean. And so, for example, you may notice that with teens in your classroom with whom you're working with tend to be very self-concerned, where they're very egocentric, focused on themselves, have a hard time to have perspective onto others. And so they feel that everything is about them. When things seem to be difficult, they think that they're the ones that are living it the hardest, that everyone is doing this towards them. And so they really feel like they're the nucleus of their world, and that what matters is what they think. And so sometimes when other people are trying to have a conversation with a teen and trying to give their perspective, they have a very hard time making space for other people's perspective because they're really focused on their own. They're very self-centered, self-concerned. This plays out in other ways as well. We'll look at this in other sections of this presentation, but I wanted to name it here because it's really important to understand that they're not doing it on purpose to be selfish or to be, egocentric. It's actually there for a reason. It is part of development. And part of the reason why they are so focused on themselves is because in the phase of adolescence, they're at a place where they are trying to figure out who they are. what are their interests, what are their thoughts, what are their will for life, their projects and so forth. And so they cannot build this sense of self and this individuation if they do not have this egocentrism. It is there to protect, to not have distractions or to have pressures to move away from the job that they need to do as an adolescent to become their own person. And so it is normal and typical at the adolescent phase to be very egocentric and self-concerned. Now, hand in hand with that comes the self-consciousness, where they're quite insecure and they feel that everybody's looking at them and they're afraid to take risks. They're afraid to look stupid. They're afraid people will laugh at them. And so all of that really plays into the diminishing of willingness to take risks, willingness to get out of their shell, to be different, to be themselves. So on the one hand, they're working on becoming themselves, but on the other hand, they're afraid to completely show all their colors because it makes them feel so insecure and self-conscious that there's this need to fit in. There's this huge need to be into the norm, to conform, to not stand out because of all of the threats that could come to that in their relationships. And so you see that dichotomy that happens at adolescence between developing your sense of self, but at the same time not feeling uncomfortable to fully be yourself because of all of the pressures and so forth, that if you are that different, then what does that mean in terms of you having friends and fitting in with your friends? Now, in terms of the speculative consciousness, what we're talking about here is that at this point at adolescence, there's a beginning of perspective, where even though they are egocentric, they're able in moment and in time to have certain ideals. So oftentimes teens are very interested in philosophy, in ethics, talking about morality and all of that. They may ask a lot of questions to make sense of this. Looking at, for example, and this is where unfortunately social media takes a lot of space, all of the influencers in social media. If you think about celebrities, all of the pressures or influence that celebrities can have on teens, because teens have this view now where they know where they are and where they want to go and what's their ideal and how to get to that ideal. And sometimes there's a bit of a magical thinking that goes behind this idealistic type of perception, where they may think that, you know, bad things happen to others but will not happen to them. They may think that even though other people have tried things and failed, that they will be successful at doing that. And this magical thinking, for example, you know, that if they want to go live by themselves, there's no kind of additional consciousness about what does it require for me to be an autonomous, independent adult in terms of being able to provide for myself. And so there's this very magical thinking about believing, this true belief, I mean, black and white belief, that they are able to live on their own, and yet not understanding all of what that means. And another example, you know, especially for those students that are not very motivated to learn, this idea that school's not necessary for them to succeed in life. And again, going back to the shame piece of social media, you see how influencers can actually make a life with this role of, you know, having a channel, let's say on YouTube or whatnot. And so it really feeds in, unfortunately, to this idealistic perception that there's different ways to be able to succeed in life, and not understanding that hard work and dedication and so forth are very necessary in order to succeed in life. And so you may get some pushback from students that are already not motivated to learn or haven't found their niche or their passion, that for them, they already have a hard time connecting with school, that adding that idealistic perspective on top just makes it that much more difficult. And so the challenge here, the temptation, should I say, for the explosion of awareness is this resistance of students to think about what it is that comes out of this explosion of awareness, and to feel what it is that comes with it. And so there's this temptation to kind of get distracted by other things and to not face the necessity of your journey. And the only way out is through. And so in order for a teen to be able to move past being self-concerned, self-conscious, and idealistic, is actually to experience all of these feelings and thoughts, and to be able to have a relationship with these things and to be able to walk them through to the other end. And so if students get distracted by that because it feels too vulnerable, or that makes them feel uncomfortable and don't want to go there, and they distract themselves by other things, for example, being on a screen all the time or hanging out with your friends to the detriment of getting to know yourself, then all of that can have an impact on the journey of the adolescent. And so the challenge here for the adults and for the teen, of course, themselves, is how can we keep them engaged and embarked on their journey that is very needed and necessary? Because as I mentioned, you can't get away from this. The only way out is through. And so the role here of adults, whether it's the teacher or the parent or whomever it is that's the adult, are threefold. The first one is in terms of adjusting the view of things. The second one is about adjusting our stance. And the third one is about making room. And so if we go back to the first one, adjusting our view here is for us to have patience and trust in the developmental process, to understand that their egocentrism and their self-consciousness and concern and so forth is part of the game, and that it's going to pass. It's a phase, and not to take a student that's self-centered too personally. In terms of adjusting our stance, and so it's restraining ourselves from imposing our own reference points. It doesn't mean we can't have a debate about things. It doesn't mean that we cannot have conversations with students about different things, whether it's philosophy or ethics or morality or any of that. But it's important to not impose our own. They need to find their own. And hopefully, and this is the piece I think that not everybody understands, is that it's not about trying to influence. It's actually through the relationship, through attachment. If the teen is attached well enough to the adults, that by wanting to connect with the adults and by the adults modeling what are the right reference points, that the student will pick and choose what suits them, but also will want to please the adults. And so there's a natural influence that happens there by default if the relationship is going well. And so it's not about trying to put pressure or to influence or to debate till death about something. Even if we think the student is wrong, it's really about making space for them to discover that, to be able to face their errors and so forth, and to learn from those mistakes. And providing tools, and this is the most important piece, providing tools and opportunity for them to self-reflect. Up until the adolescent phase, adults were very much present to tell students or children what is right from wrong. And so now that we're at the adolescent phase, now is the time and the opportunity to help them, make space for them to discover through experience and errors, trial and error, what are, the right from the wrong. And of course, the last piece is making room. And so making room, all of these kind of go hand in hand, making room for the teens' thoughts and ideas, making room for their exploration and their expression in whichever form that is. And so in terms of expression, it's not just a question of talking about or cognitive awareness. It's actually trying on through different types of activities, through art or through journaling or poetry or sketching or music or photography or dance or movement or whatever, that all of these different types of activities can help the teen stay engaged into self-discovery. And the positive thing about all these activities is that it's much less direct and much less threatening for them to get engaged in their journey through these mediums than to sit down face to face and to have to talk about these things that are very difficult to even conceive. And so I would say that most time than not, most students have an easier time through different types of mediums than conversation to walk through their journey on a cognitive level. So now we're going to move over to the second section, which is the individuation process, which I've kind of hinted a little bit in this first part. And so the individuation process is basically that once the student has grown into their roots, and so they're able to build their relationships, that they have with adults and feeling safe and feeling grounded and so forth. It's only then can they focus. Remember, I had talked about the student who's in trauma and in survival mode. When you're in survival mode, there isn't this growing of the roots. And so once the growing of the roots is happening, then you've got the plant that is able to grow out from good roots, very deep roots and strong roots. And so understanding that the development of self, the individuation process, or another term I could use is emergence. And so these are all synonyms. It can only happen, this is luxury, it can only happen if attachment is safe and present and constant. And so if we look at a different way of speaking of the same thing, this chart here is from the Neufeld Institute. Gordon Neufeld is the founder of the Neufeld Institute. He's an attachment theorist, and he's explained 6 different ways in which individuals attach to each other. And so the first one is just by being with physically through the senses, spending time together, and so forth. The second one, and this is so typical of the adolescent because it's actually not something that's too threatening, and you see this much more in their peer relationship, is through things they have in common. And so it could be activities they have in common, interests and likes that they have in common. It could even be physical appearances and so forth. And so this is the second way in which individuals attach. Now, remember before I said that it's not about imposing our own reference points. It's through the relationship that this will give us natural influence. And so if the student is attaching to us through sameness and that we're modeling good values and good, just a good modeling, students will abide by what it is that we have to put out there because they want to please us and they want to be like us. Now, the competition that we have with adolescents is their peers, because who resembles more peers than a teen than a teen? Because they're more similar in terms of physical appearance, in terms of the way they dress, in terms of their interests and so forth. And so peers become a huge competition to adults because of sameness. And so the idea here is that if we continue to deepen the relationship, then peers will be less competitive to us because now we'll have other ways in which teens will attach to us, and it will make it that then the other teens won't be as much in competition. So the next level is belonging and loyalty. And so a sense of belonging to the classroom, a sense of loyalty to your classmates or to your teacher and so forth. This is a two-way street. And so it's not just that the teen feels this, it's how can the adults demonstrate proximity? How can the adults demonstrate that there's some sameness in different ways? How can the adult demonstrate that there's some loyalty and some belonging in the group? Fourth way is here a sense of significance. How often do we have students that are searching in adults in their lives to feel special, to feel that they matter, to feel that their opinion is being valued and so forth? And so to be able to make time and space for that, it makes it that much more important. Of course, the fourth, and oftentimes in a school setting, you will probably see the first four. The last two are more in intimate relationships, whether it's with immediate family or it's close friends and so forth, where there is a mutual kind of appreciation. We call this love, mutual affection and so forth. And the last one is being known, where it's really difficult for us to hide secrets from those we're close to. We want them into our inner circle. And so there's no secrets to divide. But I would say if you're able to build with your students past sameness to at least belonging and loyalty and significance, you know then that you have what you need, that the teen will want to please you through wanting to be like you, wanting to be loyal to you, and wanting to continue to matter to you. And so the more that you have a deeper relationship, the easier it is to get teens to follow through with expectations and to take on our reference points. And of course, if the attachment goes well and all of that is stable, then the maturation comes on its own. There's no need to teach maturation. You cannot teach a student And I think that's a nuance that's important to see here, that's different from a developmental approach to any other approach, is that there's no such thing to teach a student to be responsible, or to teach a student to be independent, or to teach a student to understand consequences and to learn from that. These are actually fruits of maturation. And so the energy of the adult should not be put to teach these fruits. It should be put into building the relationship. And once that relationship is built, all of that comes out by default on its own. And so the important piece is to focus on the roots. Now, if I were to explain to you in terms of an individuation how this happens, understand that at the first part, I talked about attachment and maturation. And so if students and children are well attached to their adults, whether it's I wrote parents here, but whether it's their parents or their teacher or whomever, that once they've got this good attachment, this makes space for the growth of the plant. And so the emergence is happening there into their personhood. This is where students will be able not just to build their sense of individuation, but also to understand where they differ from other people. And so, yes, you have things in common with other people, but you also have things that are very unique to you where you are different from others. And you see, if you have, to go back to the roots of attachment, if you have a deep relationship with many people, if a teen has good relationships with many people beyond just sameness, being different doesn't become a threat. Being different feels okay to them because they know that even though they don't have everything in common with their friends and with their relationships with their village, that they still can stay connected with those people through belonging and loyalty and through significance. But if you have a teen that is very immature, very defended, having a hard time deepening relationships, and really is a very surface level type of person in the way they relate, then being different is the worst threat ever, because it threatens them being able to connect through sameness. And so this is why sometimes we will notice in some of the teens that we work with that there's this kind of, I don't want to say obsession, but there's almost kind of this need, this deep need to all cost to fuse to others, to be like others, to be worried about being different. Because if you are, and that you're just attaching to people through sameness, then it means that you can't even attach to people through sameness, and all what's left is through physical proximity. And so this is why it's different from one teen to a next, and it really gives you a cue to where teens are at in their attachment capacity by seeing how they're threatened by being themselves and being different versus absolutely needing to all costs to fuse to others and to fit in and to conform. And so, of course, if the teen is capable of differentiation and continuing to becoming their own person, then they're able to relate to others, to peers, without losing themselves in those relationships. And so we call this integration in the sense that they can be themselves, but it could also be themselves within others where they're different. And so there's an integration of perspective, there's an integration and so forth of relationship. And so the challenge here for the teen and for the adults that they're working with is that for many teens, the temptation is to conform, because if you don't conform, if you're not like others, then, oh my goodness, the fear that if you're different, will you be rejected? And so the challenge then is to be yourself, and to be yourself, even if you have peers that are not in agreement with parts of you, that you're still able to show yourself all parts of you. And so, of course, if you have a teen that doesn't have good relationship with adults, that is not building their personhood because they're in survival mode and is still quite immature and they're stuck and defended, then they're not able to relate to peers without losing themselves. And now comes the fusion. And now this is where comes peer influence. And of course, peer influence can happen in a teen that has better capacity to hold on to themselves. But oh my goodness, the peers who cannot hold on to themselves, the fusion to the peers and the peer influence is that much more severe. And I talked about just a second ago how for adolescents, showing all parts of yourself and how, there's parts of yourself that you might be comfortable with and proud of and so forth, but there's also other parts of yourself that you might be ashamed of, or that you might be embarrassed, that you don't feel comfortable showing and so forth. And so there's this huge kind of journey for the adolescent to not just hold on to the parts that they like, but to hold on to all parts of themselves, whether they're embarrassed of that or not. And that's a huge, huge challenge for adolescents. And so the role here for the adults, and you'll notice from section to section that I have all of the three. And so to recognizing that there's a huge temptation at adolescents to conform due to how the development is set up and to their immaturity. And so if you had that adolescence was at a time where teens were more mature and more grown into themselves, then you wouldn't have as much temptation. But understanding the immaturity and the fact that they're not fully individuated, of course the temptation is that much stronger. And so knowing when to take a step back to make space for them to explore themselves, and when to step in because you see that the teen is getting caught up with their peers, being very fusional, and how can we help them reorient back onto the adults so they don't get lost in that. Staying present in the process, coming alongside the angst and the confusion from the teen that is going through this very kind of dichotomous type of journey, where on the one hand, there's a want to becoming themselves and a fear as well. And making room for the adolescent, all parts of themselves, even if these are things that we don't agree with, and to help them explore their identity, to explore their sense of self. And so there's different ways that are aspects of the self. First of all, there's the physical aspect of yourself, the way you appear. And so this is why we often notice that adolescents go through these different experimental phases of trying on different things, trying on different clothing, trying on different styles, and so forth. And so all of that is part of that journey. Of course, there's a portion that's emotional, that ties into their being able to make sense of these different emotions that we have, and even the emotions that are uncomfortable in terms of our thoughts. So whether it's our opinions or views or values or interests and so forth, making space to have different questions. And we could have a thought one week and have an opposite thought the following week, and different beliefs and countering beliefs and so forth. This is the time now in their lives. If any time, now is the time at adolescence to be trying on different hats and exploring as best as they can to really figure out who they are and who they want to become. In terms of social, in terms of who they are by themselves versus with their friends versus with their family, with their community. Sometimes teens can be a bit of a chameleon where they have different shapes, and they put on a mask depending on who they're with. Social media as a whole, oh my goodness, with filters and such, that brings on a whole other layer of masks and such, with the social piece. And so trying on those personas. And of course, the spiritual beliefs, the meaning in life, the existential questions and so forth. There's so many kind of, curiosity and questions at this age about all of these different aspects of the self. And so, of course, as you're building your sense of self, comes with it the instinct of counterwill. And I'll speak a little bit about that. Counterwill is a necessary instinct where students need to push back on the will of others, resist and oppose the will of others in order to become themselves. And so the counterwill instinct, which is typically what we call opposition and resistance, is a defensive reaction to perceived control and coercion on the one hand, but also it serves development by preparing the way for separate functioning. And so I mentioned before that the teen needs to put a bubble around them to be able to discover who they are, what are their interests, what are their thoughts, and so forth. And so as they're putting that bubble also is a pushback, to the adults' kind of expectations and so forth. And so if we look at it from this angle, depending on the capacity for the students to have their own initiatives, have their own purposes, have their own desires, have their own their want-tos, their interests, if the adults, or I'm saying adults, but anybody's, expectations are grander than the teen's initiative, then the expectation will feel much more coercive to them than if they have their own initiative. What I would say to you as an adult is, rather than pushing expectations, try to make space for them to find their initiative in it, to be able to help meet the expectation that you have. In terms of your pressure, rather than putting more pressure, let's try to find their sense of purpose in whatever it is that we're trying to put pressure on. In terms of demands, let's try to find their desire in it. Instead of the have tos, where are their want tos? In terms of the directives, where are their intentions? In terms of their input, where's their curiosity? And in terms of incentives and rewards, rather than trying to coerce them into something through rewards, interest in the student can go so much further than just going at it bit by bit with rewards. And just FYI, as a side line, rewards are actually a detriment to the development of the self, because students, if students get caught up in rewards, then it's no longer about intrinsic motivation, it is about extrinsic motivation. So you're doing it for somebody else, not for yourself. And it really interferes with the development of emergence and individuation. And so just please be mindful about that in terms of, and it's okay to have, a Friday where, students have worked really well all week and you want to celebrate their hard work with something, but there's a difference between celebrating and naming and so forth, than using rewards on a constant basis, in a system type of base, to get the behavior that we want, where it's more of a coercive type of thing. And so, of course, with the adults, the piece here is for us to be patient and understand that the counter will instinct is something that is natural and normal, and that as the teen will gain more maturity and get to know themselves better, that it will diminish. And so taking it less personally, understand that it's an instinct that's involved, being careful not to do harm, and to kind of upping the ante and pushing the pressure even further. Now, one piece that I forgot to mention is that, of course, if you have a student that is emerging well, then of course you will be able to more easily to find their curiosity and their interests and their purpose and initiatives and such. But if you have a very stuck adolescent that is very immature, sometimes it's very difficult for them to even be aware of or to name all of these different things. And so it makes it that much more difficult to get past the resistance and opposition, because there is no room for their initiatives and from themselves, because they don't see them, or they don't connect to them. And so the piece there is not to go at it from their emergence or to appeal to their emergence. It's actually about being careful into the relationship. And so if you're in a place where student is feeling a lot of pressure and resisting you, then it's about kind of easing up on the pressure, using humor, and being able to reconnect a bit further with the student before you move forward with the expectation and so forth. And so attachment goes a long way with immature, stuck students. And so in terms of our stance, normalizing and conveying that some pushback is part of the process. It's normal at adolescence to have your own ideas, to want to debate, the thoughts and ideas and initiatives of adults, and to invite that, to make space for that. Placing the teen in charge where possible, so they're able to, make sense of their sense of responsibility, their sense of accountability, and so forth. And so a lot of that is gained through experience, and not by trying to teach them what we've lived. They need to live it themselves. And of course, making room for their will, and to be as patient as we can, and understanding that they're not doing this on purpose. It's part of the development. All right, so the next part is in terms of the emotional journey. And oh my goodness, at adolescence, there's at any part in life, there's emotions, but it's very heightened at the adolescent phase, because they are going through so many challenges and being confronted with that. And it can be very frustrating or upsetting to teens. and reminding ourselves that because they're very immature, we're looking here at the brain. The center of emotions is the limbic systems, that is right here. And in the middle of that is the amygdala. The amygdala is what kicks off the emotions. And so a mature individual, yes, will have kickoff in the limbic system, but will also have activation in the prefrontal cortex to help slow down, to help temper, to help give perspective, to help regulate some of the emotions. But if you have a very immature teen, then there's not much filter that's happening there. And it's almost a straight out kind of reaction where you don't have the filtering of the prefrontal cortex. And so, of course, a lot of these different intense feelings that students may have that is typical of adolescence are that much more intense and unfiltered and more impulsive because of the immaturity of the teen. And so this is where you may see a variation from teen to teen, depending on their maturation. And so here are examples of emotions where there's fears around separating from others, being separate, to be a separate being, to changing because you're becoming an adult, and there's a change in relationships as well. And so this, has a huge impact and brings forth a lot of emotions in adolescence, where they feel that everything's changing around them. They don't feel as close to their parents or to their family members, or even to the school staff, that there's been a shift there that's happening in the relationships. That they have a hard time connecting with what's happening inside them, and not sure what they're feeling, because there's just so many emotions happening at the same time. It's hard to kind of separate what really is happening there. A lot of alarm and fear at this age, where the world is opening up, and it's exciting on the one hand because adolescents are getting more freedoms. But at the same time, it's also scary where, and remember, I talked about the self-consciousness at that age. And so there's this fear about being judged and about people that are looking at them, that there's so many things happening around them that it feels overwhelming. There's just too much happening at once. That I'm critical about everything because I can imagine how it should be. And so why isn't? And that's the idealistic perspective that, sometimes there's this magical thinking that, things should just be the way they want. And no, life is not always like that. There will be things in life that you can't have the way that you want, and you need to accept and to adapt to that. And so, preschoolers go through this phase of the no's and all of what we call the life utilities, things where they're out of your hands, they're not in your control, and you just can't change them. You can't be the best at everything. You can't win all the time. There's things in life, for example, if you're, the eldest child and you have, your parents had another child, you can't change that. So there's a lot of adaptations that need to happen in life. And even more so at the phase of adolescence, because it's such an intense period in terms of emotion, so much frustration. I'm feeling so irritated. And the other piece too is the hormones, right? I mean, let's not forget that hormones at adolescence with puberty has a huge impact on emotions, and brings it to that next level. And so it is normal for adolescents to be very emotional and to also kind of really, almost kind of like extremes. Well, they'll go from being happy to being mad to back to laughing to now sad. And there's like this very highs and lows and so forth. It is so typical of this phase. Of course, there's some loss and some grief during the phase of adolescence, the loss of your childhood, the grief of the fact that you will no longer have this part of yourself. Yes, it's exciting to become an adult, but it's also sad that, nothing will be the same anymore, that even if you want to stay a child, you can't. You want things to slow down, but they can't. Life moves forward. That things are becoming much more complicated. You have many more responsibilities and accountability than you had before, and that can be, very overwhelming. That you want things to be as easy as they were before, and it's not possible. There's sadness, of course, and aloneness that comes with that. Aloneness in the sense, if I go back to if I go back to the different types of attachment, aloneness in the sense that if you are no longer the same, and so you're becoming different, and so already it doesn't help for you to not feel connected, but also on the last level of being known. If many people don't know who you are, or that you are embarrassed to show parts of you, this brings up a lot of feelings around the sense of being alone, the sense of, oh, excuse me, I jumped one too fast, of that people don't get you, people don't understand you, that there's part of you that you can't bring out there because you're afraid of doing that. And so it makes you feel alone because people don't get to see you fully. More feelings that come forward in terms of independence, where some, refuse to move towards independence because there's a lot of repercussions that comes with that. And there's pushback too. Remember about the counter will. If you tell me to do something, I will do the opposite. If you demand it, I'll refuse it. I mean, this is all the counter will. If you keep on nagging me, I'll tune out. If you force me to feel or think a certain way, I won't. And so you could see that there's a lot of feelings and the instinct that's part of it with the need for independence. And also some confusion and uncertainty. I don't know how I feel about anything. Nothing feels definite. Everything feels cloudy. Sometimes I even feel crazy. Nothing is black and white anymore. And that's the explosion of the consciousness, right? Where when they were young, things were much more black and white. And now all of a sudden with maturity, there's more gray zones that are happening. And this is what philosophy and ethics is about, right? About debating certain things and looking at the gray zones of things. But that becomes very uncertain and uncomfortable, confusing to teens, because up until then, they felt more certain about things. And now all of a sudden, they're no longer as certain as they thought they were. And sometimes I can't even handle my own thinking. It scares me. How often teens at this phase, will write poems to be able to make sense of their world, or through sketching and drawing will, to be able to, again, to help them kind of just put it on paper because it's just so jumbled in their mind. And of course, what may come out of this is the fact that the teen may, to protect themselves, numb out some of these emotions because they're too difficult to feel, or to tune out to what they're seeing because it's too difficult to see, and to back out of relationships because it's too vulnerable and it hurts. And so this is the danger of having emotions that are too intense because it's just too up there. And so, of course, the temptation is for teens to try to avoid feeling certain things. And again, I keep on talking about social media, but social media is an easy, quick way to avoid feeling and thinking because you distract yourself with a screen or with, exchanging online in a very superficial type of way. And so the challenge here is how can we make room for all of the emotions, including the hard ones, including I'm looking for the shame, for shame and for sadness, to make space for that. And so, of course, for the adults, acknowledging that emotions happen to us as opposed to us choosing this or that it's under our control. Understanding that maturation is the key to managing emotions. Recognizing emotions as being untempered and intense, and that it's normal at the adolescent phase until they mature. Staying present all the way through of the emotions. Keeping the student or others safe. And so if emotions, explode and a student becomes very aggressive, that it's not about trying to shut it down. It's about trying to bring the student somewhere else where they're able to then express those emotions safely out of harm, not to cause harm to themselves or others. Not alarming the teen with our own emotions, our own disapproval or frustration of their emotions. Making room for the emotions that come up, including the dark emotions, if they need to talk about those things. How often I have had in my practice talking with teens where they need to know about stuff like death and about suicide and all of these self-harm and all of these things. And it doesn't mean that they're asking questions, that it means that they're going to do it. It's that they need to make sense of it and to be able to explore these things, to make space for these conversations. And of course, for the expression to release itself, even the uncomfortable things. Now, please understand that in order for a teen to be able to self-regulate and to reflect on their emotions, so the self-regulation, the other term is mixing. And so to be able to mix their emotions and to temper them and to be able to reflect on their emotions, first they must need to be able to have room and permission to express those emotions. And so you need to start at the beginning where there's some co-regulation that is happening there. And so no self-regulation can happen without co-regulation first. And so the adult is meant to be there as a model, to be there as a support and so forth, to be able to build emotional literacy, to name different emotions. I've noticed, I should have put a picture up here, but on the internet, if you want to Google an emotion wheel, I've seen this, it's terrific, where there's kind of like the basic five or six emotions, and then the wheel gets bigger with the nuances and intensity of all of the different the five core emotions in kind of magnified in different variations of that emotion. It's called an emotion wheel. And so that could be a great tool to use when you're talking with teens about where they're at in terms of their emotions. Another way is in terms, again, through an indirect, non-threatening type of medium, whether it's through art, without using words. Sometimes words is just too much. Teens, get caught up in the conversation piece, and it makes it safer to do it one step removed in some sort of activity. Now, I talked about taking a wrong turn, and I kind of alluded to it a little bit when I had one of my key insights when we talked about peer orientation. And I talked about it too in terms of technology and how technology can be something that adds on a whole other layer of issues. There's a book, if you're interested, called Alone Together, that talks about the fact that we've never been more connected with technology, but never felt more alone. So I invite you to go and take a look. There's a TED Talk about this book. And so I invite you to go and see this. And the other piece too is in terms of the peers having the relationship with the peers. Now, if the peers take more space than the adults, now the danger is that teens will no longer take cues from the adults, they will start taking cues from their peers. And so when you think about the attachment roots, they will build deeper attachment roots with their peers and not with adults. And so what will happen is that the adults, rather than getting the positive polarity of attachment and have adults that want to listen to look up to want to please the adults, they will be caught up in the negative polarity of the attachment. It's a very instinctive type of it's not something teens choose, it happens to them. And so they will move into the opposite, and all of these things will come up. I forgot to mention that I will be sending out the handout. So please don't take too many notes. You will have this handout. I will send it to you. And so the temptation here, of course, for the teen is to connect superficially or to disconnect altogether because it feels safer to do that. And so how can we help them stay attached in their roots? So the last piece here is in terms of what teens need from us. And so, of course, what teen needs from us, I kind of spoke about it through and through, is adjusting our view, adjusting our stance, and making room for. But the other piece too is in terms of the attachment, can we show keenness to teens, showing enjoyment, showing warmth, that when they come in our class, walk through this door, what do they see from our nonverbal communication? Are we trying to see the teen past their mistakes? Do we try to get involved, meet them at their interests, get involved further than just academics, trying to be silly, not being afraid of showing our humorous side? In terms of communication, it's no longer about them listening to us. It now becomes this more kind of not equal, but in the sense that we're now kind of more of a coach where we're listening more, we're guiding more. It's not about us telling them right from wrong, but letting them figure it out and that we're there to accompany them through that. And in terms of the dialogue, moving, as I just mentioned, into a consultative type of role and making room for their thoughts and feelings. And timing is key in the sense that you want to make sure that the teen is actually engaged in the relationship in that moment. Even if they've done something wrong, if you go at them when they're not engaged in the relationship, there's no receptivity from the teen to be able to discuss this further. And so timing is key. You want to make sure that you wait until you and them are in a better place before you discuss something further. So I will stop the recording.